What we're going to do now is use the refractometer, which basically is a device that measures light bending to tell how much sugar is in there, in that liquid. It's nice to know when you're starting how much sugar you have. If you have a very low sugar content, then you're not going to expect a lot of alcohol out of it. If you had a very high sugar content, then you're going to expect a lot more. And it's some things can be so high that you don't want that much because it's going to kill the yeast. If you had like a 40% sugar in there, it would kill the yeast that you put in. So you have to keep it adjusted. We're going to we aim somewhere between 10 and 20%. This device uses the light passes through the juice and the sugar clarity of the juice. The sugar content of the juice bends the light in a certain way. So the more sugar, it bends it more, and less sugar, it bends it less. And it's projected onto a scale in here. I just pass it around and look through it. And then there's nothing in there now, but I just wanted to let you see.
A refractometer?
A refractometer, yeah. We could use a specific gravity test using a hydrometer floating in a tube, but it's messy. This is just so much easier.
Does it work with a light bulb, or can?
No, you hold it up to the light. You can. Some of them are lit. Some of them self-lit. It's like a telescope. You turn this to adjust the fineness of it. You can see there's a scale in there. On one side, there's the percentage. On the left side, and on the right side, there's specific gravity. And when we put the, you want to see it? The scale of the percentage gravity of the specific gravity is more fine. It's not critical. I mean, maybe in a situation where you've invested, you're making 1,500 gallon batches and you want just the absolute most out of it. That's more important.
This hydrometer is pretty cheap. That
well, this thing looks expensive. Actually, I wouldn't have bought it. Not even 2010. I priced it. It was 195 something, and I said I'm not buying it. I borrowed this. I used to teach at the school at the college there, so I borrowed theirs. But I was looking online. This thing's only $39, $40. I figured I must get it. Yeah.
Right.
So it's just the way it is.
Good for checking batteries too.
Yeah, it's good. What they use them for is to check fruit, the fruit, the fructose in the apples. I mean, around here, to see how much sugar content's in the apples on the vine, on the tree. Yeah, exactly. And if they're meeting requirements or expectations for that variety, like they know it's supposed to be a certain level of sugar content in the Fuji as opposed to a Macintosh, so they can do it that way.
That's what we should have done with that sugar cane.
So what we're going to do is I'm just going to put a little bit of this on the.
You can check the charge of the battery with it too?
It's just light. There's no. It's just just passes it through there.
But you said something about checking batteries.
Oh, he did. Yeah. You can check the hydrochloric acid and the mixture. It's a lot of things can be used with this thing. Yeah. Got about 13%, which is not quite as good as I thought we would, but that's what it is. Let me try it again. Which, it's okay. I mean, it's not, apples, some of the juices that you get in the store, the cold pressed apple juice can be, 28%, without a problem. Sometimes you get a really high sugar content, but often enough when I see that, like instead of crushing these apples, I could have gone to the orchard and just bought their fresh pressed cider and bought it in a bottle. As long as it's not been treated in any way, no preservatives or anything, it'll be fine for our purposes. I mean, I thought we'd do better with real apples, so that's why we're doing it. But you have to be really careful when you buy the jugs because sometimes they're fortified. Sometimes they put sugar in along with the natural sugar. So that's not really a natural. I mean, it'll still work, but it's not really a real test of the apple. I'm just going to do it one more time to make sure, maybe in a different place.
Will it matter if you take it from the bottom or the top?
Yeah, it would, and it also matters if you take it from a place where it might have a pulp as opposed to just more water. But I'm just going to try it. Yeah, it's basically still about 13. You can see. Hold it so that that part's flat, just up a little bit like that.
Where's the
Between the white and the blue line.
white and the blue line?
The line that the break between the white and the blue line. That's your.
Oh, okay.
See on the left side, it's just under 15.
Yeah.
Now I'm just going to take a little pH test again to see if we're down. The point is we have to be down acid-y enough to kill any bacteria. That's with the sugars especially, it really needs to be. That has to be kept in check because, as I said, they spoil quicker, and so the bacteria can have more of a chance to get a foothold. So we want to keep it down about 4.2, somewhere in there, mid 4s maybe. And so we can sort of see what we got with that. We're reading about 392.
3.92?
Yeah.
That's that acidic?
Yeah.
Well,
The meter doesn't lie.
I would not again.
I'll put a little baking soda in there, see what that does. I don't want to be too crazy with it because we don't want to get, it's much better to be more acidic than it is to be too alkaline. Try a little bit at a time and see how it goes. Okay, hit 4.0 at that point for a minute. So a little bit more, we want about 4.2. Four 2.6, 4.21, 4.2, 4.8, 4.44. A little bit more. We're pretty close. Four 2.6, 4.19. Okay, we're going to call it that. So basically, we've checked the sugar content, and so we know what to expect out of it. And we've checked the pH to make sure that the yeast can function at that level, which it can. It's not quite ready yet, so we can let it sit. It's down to about 150 degrees outside in the kettle, and it can't fall below 135. So either myself or Pat will be checking it every once in a while. It can go longer than an hour. It can go an hour and a half, 2 hours if you wanted to. The point is that the main thing is the temperature can't drop below 135, and the other thing is if it stays too long in the open like that, in an extended period like that, it does invite more bacteria to come in. But open fermentation, and I can probably explain that a little bit later on. But the open fermentation is practiced more than you might think in beer making and stuff. People do it all the time. We don't, we normally try to keep it closed and have an airlock on it once the yeast is working, so only gas can come out while the process is going on and no air can get in. But in some of the craft beer manufacturers, or anywhere, more than you might think, they just have open ferment tanks, which I have a picture of in there. They tend to have like very sterile rooms and keep the air real clean and through filters and everything, and they'll have people sometimes will wear like lint-free clothing and things like that. In European countries, if they do it, it's much less stringent. The old way, they just open ferment and they just live with the results. So that's that. Basically, I wanted to show you we're going to heat this a little bit, and then basically put some yeast in it. Let's take it over there and just cook a little bit. Great. Okay, let's just take it over there and do it. The must is cooking, or the juice. We don't need to boil it. I'm just trying to heat it a little bit to help. That'll help things along. Just help those chunks in there to break down a little bit more and get everything more evenly distributed in here. You said you made wine? Mm-hmm. Okay. There is a pectic enzyme. It's mainly for winemakers. It helps helps do some of the conversion. I don't. Do you ever use that?
I just started using it. I hadn't for years, but
Okay, so that's there. I'm not gonna put it in. It's available. We could do a test. I mean, if we were testing, we could do a batch with and without and see if there's any results from the same apples. The same thing. Split it and see if the results are any better. If the sugar conversion's any better. But I don't. I just want to make you aware of it. We could use it. Put that back. And this is called Fermex. And when we pitch the yeast, when we put the yeast in there, we're going to put a little bit of this in because it's a yeast nutrient. It's just a powdered nutrient that helps feed the yeast and it just makes them more active and working in the in the solution. So I think that's worth a little bit. It's probably I think it's like a teaspoon a gallon or something like that. It's a powdered product here. So it's basically a ammonium sulfate kind of product that is basically essentially what we use in fertilizers. But we're not drinking this, it just helps the yeast, boosts them up a little bit. Got a little digital thermometer this time, so it'll be easier. I don't really have a goal of temperature particularly. It's just you want to get it probably over 120. Oh, we need more heat. It's about 75 now. I'm doing a real quick check on the temperature outside in the kettle we're working on over there, and then I'll be right back. What we're going to do next is drop the yeast in there. I'm just waiting for the temperature to come up a little bit before we do that. I think what I'd like to do after we do that, basically, then we can go put the yeast in that one out there, and then that'll be that for the fermentation end of things. That's as far as we can go, because after that point, with both of these, it'll take 5 to 7 days for that fermenting process to function and actually make the 15% alcohol we're looking for, the 13%, whatever it is. So we don't have that time frame in our class here. But I just wanted to show you these steps that it has to be babysat. I mean, you have to really keep your eye on temperatures, pH, and sugar content and that kind of thing. So what I can do while we're waiting for that to go is talk a little bit about the stills themselves. What's happening is we have a kettle or a cauldron of fermented solution, mixture, wort, mash, whatever you want to call it, that contains about let's just say 15% alcohol and 85% water. That's basically what it is. So what the goal is to drive that water drive as much water as we can out of that solution, so that as we proceed with our distillation process to distill the water out of it, that percentage of alcohol is going to increase because we're taking more and more and more water away. So this is a little confusing because this is definitely not a very efficient still at all. I mean, it will make alcohol, but it has to be run through many times to actually get higher strength. So this is not what we want. This is a motel somewhere up in it's either in eastern Tennessee or extreme western North Carolina, but they just put the still out there for display. It's a copper still. There's a kettle. There's a fire that's built under there. The mash is put in here. The vapors come up through here and through into that tube and get condensed. In other words, the water drops out of the solution, and the vapors of alcohol continue, and then it goes through a secondary condenser. And this kind of thing, it's so inefficient that I don't really. I probably wouldn't be able to operate it very well. I mean, it would make alcohol, but I don't understand. It's just what they had. It's just what they had to work with in those days. You'll notice the tubes are all very thick because that's the vapors going through the tubes, and it has to be open enough to let the vapors go through. How are we doing, Pat?
Okay, you're at 122.
Okay.
Turn it off.
Yeah, just turn it off here. And that's basically a drawing of what that other thing was. But I don't want to, I really don't want to put too much emphasis on that because it's not what we're going to ultimately be talking about. Okay, this is a mash kettle. this is a typical mash kettle, open top kettle, and the motorized agitator at the top. So that's basically what we're doing out there is basically right here on a much bigger scale. It's almost always stainless steel. Sometimes they're copper, but they're almost always stainless steel because they're, it's durable and cheaper than copper, and it's more, doesn't bend as easily and all that stuff. You can clean it without damaging it. So that's just the part that's cooking the mash. And this is a 150-gallon distillation unit, the entire distillation apparatus. Can everybody see? The mash is in that kettle there. It's a column that drops an initial amount of water out as the alcohol vapors rise. It gets pumped into, that's a tube that actually goes up. You can't see the top of it, but it comes back down here, and it gets introduced into this other column, which is the finer, the more effective and efficient stripping column. And then it gets condensed in here on the right side. So what's happening is that alcohol, under heat, alcohol turns into a vapor at about 173.4 degrees, I think it is, 73 or 73.6. So about 173, the alcohol vapors come off. Water boils at 212. That's when the water vapor comes off. So we're taking advantage of that differential to drive the alcohol vapors out and leave the water behind. And essentially what's going to happen is that every run through this is going to be recirculating a higher content of alcohol mix, and eventually when we come to the end of it, almost all that water is going to be out of it and the alcohol vapor is going to be left. And then the vapor gets condensed by running cold water through it. There's a couple different ways of doing it, but basically you're introducing the vapor to cold water without actually mixing the water and the vapor. The cold water is usually run through a tube, and the vapor will then drop out and be collected, and that's our product. So it's really not, the theory is not all that difficult. I mean, it's pretty straight up. Does everybody understand that? You know, what I just said with that, because that's going to be really important to just understand how that whole flow works. We're just using those columns to pull out as much water on its travels through as possible by whatever means. I mean, there's several ways of doing it, but by whatever means we can. Once we've reached a vapor that is almost pure alcohol, we put cold water to it, so it turns that vapor into liquid and drops out, and then we collect it in a little container. And actually they have what they call a parrot. As the alcohol forms and it gets collected, it gets fed into a little cup, and you put a hydrometer in there so you can get a constant, the hydrometer floats and lets you read the alcohol content. So as that fluid alcohol is moving through that parrot, and it constantly goes through it and then drains out into your collecting vessel, the hydrometer will float in that parrot cup, and you can read, in real time exactly what your proof is, and you can keep an eye on it. So if you're starting to see a weaker product, then you're going to have to adjust your condenser or turn up your heat or turn down your heat, or whatever it takes to make that vaporization process work more efficiently. So that's why we use the parrot. I don't know why it's called a parrot, but that's what it's called. But it's just a real-time hydrometer reading. So let's quit this now, and we'll do the yeast back here, since that's ready. It's heated to 120 degrees, what Pat said. 122 degrees, it's probably 120 now. So you've got basically a nice little mixture. There are some pieces floating in there, but I'm not going to bother to strain it because they're so small, I'm not worried about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a little bit of yeast nutrient. But before I do that, I'm going to prepare our yeast starter. So basically just take a 95 degree water, and I'll put it in this cup here, and then we'll put in generally about a quarter teaspoon per gallon. So I'll just estimate that, and we'll mix it in with the water so we get a little bit of a culture started, and then I'll put it in there. So now I'm just preparing. I'm just aiming for a target of about 95 degrees here. This has been sterilized earlier with the spray. So let's see what we got here for temperature. About 94 degrees, so that's good. And let me see. I think we'll put this in at about, I think it's a teaspoon per gallon. This is the yeast nutrient. Too much of this isn't going to hurt anything. I just, I'll put in a teaspoon of it for this little amount. I don't know if we really even measured this. How many gallons is here? I don't know what we say, about 2 gallons, I think, probably. A little less. Just a little bit of the salt in here, and that's about enough. It's not, we're just a little bit of nutrient here. Stir it up. We can't pitch the yeast if it's too hot in here, which it probably is. At 109 degrees, so we're definitely too much at this point. If we put the yeast in there at this point, it would kill the yeast. So we want to let this cool.
You were showing us the yeast before, and you had a certain packet that said turbo yeast on it, and then
This is
a different yeast.
Yes, this is a different yeast. A turbo yeast is specifically for starch-based products. The alpha and beta enzymes and the turbo yeast are for starch products, and this is a fruit or basically a wine yeast.
Because fruit goes down to fructose or dextrin, and
it goes to there's fructose in it and dextrins, and then this yeast is a more alcohol tolerant yeast. I should put it this way: a normal beer compared to a normal beer yeast, this yeast is more quite a bit more alcohol tolerant. It will not die until it gets up to a fairly high percentage of alcohol, meaning, it could be up in the upper teens. They have developed the turbo yeasts to bring the characteristics of the wine yeast into the starch-based products. So essentially, as far as the alcohol goes, strength of alcohol, the turbo yeast in this will be pretty equal. The turbo yeast is actually a little more tolerant even, but I just got this because it is a fruit pectin yeast. Apple type wine yeast, or apples and grapes and stuff. So that's why I did that. It's too hot now here anyway. I'm going to go out and check the temperature in that other tub, and then I can see how we get this open and we can mix a little starter. This conversion wasn't really all that great. I suspect that there was too much heat at the bottom. See how it's changed? You can see before it was thin and sort of you could see the water, and now it's actually gotten a little more broken down and more to a porridge. You can actually see it, on the paddle. Not perfect, not particularly really even that near to perfect, but it's still, that's what we got, and we're gonna just live with this. It's done what it's supposed to do. It just hasn't. It's not a great conversion, but we'll live with that. It can't get down below 135. It can't get above 167. So we've got a schedule to keep and all that stuff. So I'm just going to basically, put the glucoamylase in there now, and we'll stir it in. You can pour it in while I stir it. Just dump it in there. Issue. There we go. We'll put it in. And it's at a comfortable temperature range, and it should sit like here for an hour. And again, most of these times aren't carved in stone. There's a lot of flexibility in here. I was worried before. Remember we discussed the fineness of the grain. Well, this has sort of solved some of that problem because it's turned into a gelatinous mass, so it's going to bind to each other. So it's not going to be so much of a, those little grains going through into the screen, because these things are big enough that you're not going to get much of that. It'll happen, but it shouldn't be all that bad. Okay, I think I'm going to put the cover on because it's 148 now, so that's good.
So we did it?
We did it. We can go inside now. Not yet. We got to put the yeast in, but that has to sit for a while. We want to talk a little bit about permitting at the state and federal level because it's necessary to make alcohol fuel. We have to have a permit. Fortunately, there's a special provision in the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is actually part of the Treasury Department now. They've made a special provision for people who are making fuel. And for us, we're called small fuel producers. And it's basically under 10,000 gallons a year. So the permit's really very simple. You can go online and just Google federal alcohol producer permit, and it'll come to that part of the web page, and then you can open the PDF and print the files. and then there's a place you can draw. You have to draw a little image of your setup, your plat or your property. It's basically questions. There's no bonding required at that level. There's no insurance required at that level. I mean, it's all basically telling them, how much you intend to make, why you're making the alcohol, what equipment you're going to use, where it's going to be made, how it's going to be protected as far as a gate, a fence, a building that's locked up, or just basically how you intend to secure it. And there's a few other questions, obviously, name and numbers, social security number, and all that stuff. They'll basically just want to know what your equipment is like, so they can gauge how much alcohol you should be making out of your feedstock. And they'll ask you on the permit what you intend to do, what your feedstock will be, and you're not locked into that. I mean, you can change that. And they'll ask you also, like, what you intend to do with it. I mean, is it experimental? Is it to fuel a vehicle or whatever? So essentially, that's really it. I mean, they're very far behind in their. I had called earlier in the year. At that point, they were 113 days behind, or a lead time. I guess they don't say behind, but it's a lead time, something like that. Several months. They just will review the form, and then they'll issue you approval on the permit, and you can. Once you get that, you can operate. You're really not allowed to operate without the permit. Not even for practicing, not even for science fairs where make a little alcohol for a science fair or whatever. There's no opening for that in the rules. And as I said before, the state will just basically take that information, and there may be some modification in it, but it's going to be essentially the same thing. They'll take that information and use that on file for issuing you the state permit, and they just follow the rules. As far as using the fuel in a motor vehicle, the road tax issue is always there. There is a federal form statement of fuel, untaxed fuel consumed. Basically, I think it's called statement of untaxed fuel consumed, or something very much like that. So if you are supposed to basically say, I drove so many miles in a vehicle with my own fuel, homemade fuel, untaxed, and that's essentially they'll give you a formula to apply the necessary tax to what you drove on, and then you just add that factor that into your tax return. So you'll be paying road tax on your fuel.
Wow.
So they figured it all out. I mean, they covered all the bases as far as they're concerned. You're not selling it as a beverage, and you are using it on the road, so you have to pay road tax on it. So that's really it in a nutshell. I mean, it's I have an image in there of the form. Yeah, Federal Form 5110-74. Application for an alcohol fuel producer permit. It's 3 different levels. We here are concerned with the small alcohol producer. There's a mid-level, and there's an upper level for people who are really doing massive fuel mixing with gasoline. People who supply for the motor industry. So that's it. It's just a little yellow form. Are we all set then? We can get on with our yeast. Okay, what I'm going to do here, the water was a little hot for the yeast. It was close enough, but I want to add a little bit of cold water here to bring the temperature down. We know the water at the tap, because I measured it, is about the pH is about 6.1. So I so little of it that I'm not too concerned about the pH balance. And again, we wanted to have a fairly low pH so that the risk of bacteria is minimized. Take another check here. Trying to get it below 95 degrees. I'm just going to a little more cold water, I think, will be on target. I believe this kind of yeast is its environment here is probably between 78 and 95. So we try to achieve that so it won't kill the yeast when we get in there. We already added a little bit of a yeast nutrient earlier, so the environment's good for procreation here. I'm going to prepare a little yeast starter. We'll take some 95-degree water from the tap, and I'll put a little bit in here, and then I'll measure in the proper amount of yeast and actually make a culture of the yeast in the vessel here, and it'll activate a little bit before we put it into the mix. Take a measurement here. That's about 83, 89, 91, 83. Okay, it's locked in at 94 degrees, so that's good. And I'll double check this. Okay, that's down to just below 95, so we're all set there. So what I'm going to do, this particular type of basically a wine yeast or a fruit yeast, is schedule on this is 1/4 teaspoon per gallon. We have about 2 gallons here, so I'm just going to put half a teaspoon. I'm actually going to put a little more in because mainly for the reason that we've had this exposed for a little bit, air, and the pH is down, so it's not going to contribute to a bacterial environment because we're knocking down the bacteria with a lower pH. But I just want to give it a little more chance by adding a little more yeast than we need. We're not scaling this. If we were in an economy situation where we're trying to use as little amount of enzyme and as little amount of yeast as possible, we'd have to be more careful. But for the purposes of this, we'll put in a little more than what's called for. And get my knife and open it up here. This is a tablespoon, so I'm just gauging it by the bottom of the spoon itself. Okay, so I've got, a fair amount of yeast here. It's probably more than, I know it's more than I need, but I'm putting it in anyway. And got the temperature adjusted, we have the pH adjusted, and we have the temperature of the yeast. Now this is not going directly into here. What we're going to do is we have brought this up, the culture up to 90, this was just under 95 degrees. So I'm going to put it in here and just give it a little opportunity to acclimate to that temperature. You can let it work here for a few minutes as long as it's warm. But this is basically just going to wake it up. All this has been stored in a cool environment in the refrigerator, and it's dormant. And I took it out, and it was cold. It wasn't cold the last few minutes, but it was the last few hours. But it was cool in my truck and all that. So it's waking up out of its dormant stage at the correct temperature, probably about 90, 93 here. It started as a grain, very granularly into a liquid now. Now we just stick it in here. They call it pitching the yeast, the official term for it. So we'll just put it in here. And I'm going to stir it in, and actually going to take the bowl because we sterilized it. I'm going to take the bowl and again, it's a low enough pH that it's not going to be, it's acidic enough that it's not going to be too much of a problem. Wash the bowl out, put the yeast in there, stir this up, and essentially, at that point, that is it. We will wait, in this case, probably 5 days. I will put a top on this. It's not going to start fermenting. It's not going to start bubbling for a little while. So I'm not going to worry about a airlock. But what we normally would do is we'd put the top on it, and there's an airlock, and I'll show you when I'll get the top here. The airlock allows the gases to escape, but does not let the air back in. This particularly doesn't have a hole in it, but we just assume that what I'm going to do is decant this into another vessel when I take it out of here. But this airlock gets filled with water into this part here. There's a floating dome. You put water into this part here about halfway up, and then you pop this on top, and that seals, that floats, and the gases have to go into the center container and then out through the water to burp out. So that means the pressure's in the container, and it's always under pressure, so it's going to burp every once in a while. It's going to burp out a little bit. Does not allow any air back in, so that's a perfect situation. Put the water in there, pop it into its hole here, and then, that's essentially it right there. And that will sit there. Of course, it's only a little batch, but that will sit there, whether it's 5 gallons, 2 gallons, or 5 gallons, or 15 gallons, or 115 gallons. It's going to sit there for, as I said, about 5 days or so. It really depends on what these are apples, but it could be peaches, it could be something else. The yeast, the kind of yeast you use in the process, the pH of the solution, and And definitely, more than anything, the temperature at which you let this sit, and it'll just be in that environment. We try to keep it stable. Fluctuations up and down are really not desirable. I mean, it doesn't always make a huge difference, but the idea is to keep it as stable as possible for your full fermentation time. What'll happen is that'll bubble. It usually takes about, well, it could take anywhere from 12, 15 hours, something like that, maybe even less. But it'll then start to burp a little bit and bubble, and it'll just continue at that rate. It'll speed up a little bit, but then it will eventually slow down at the tail end of its run. And when it comes to the point in 5 or 7 days when it burps, when it takes more than a minute or so, several minutes to make the next one, you're at the point where it's really, just about winding down. And you don't want to let it, if you let it stay too long, there's always a risk it may just go sour, turn to vinegar. But so you try to rescue it there and get it into distillation before the fermentation stops completely, because you don't want it to spoil. So that is essentially it for the sugar, for the sugar part. A week from now, this will be ready for distillation if we choose to, if that's what we're doing with it. For winemakers or whatever, it would be on to other things. But we're just going to basically strip the water out of this solution and just leave the alcohol behind, and that's what we're doing. Okay, let's see, what is this? The ratio here is 5, half a pound to 50 gallons. It's 8 ounces to 50 gallons, so we only had 5 gallons, so that's 50.
0.8.
It's really only a tenth of what we need. So 8 ounces times 0.1. It's really not even an ounce. It's just under. I'm going to put an ounce in. As I said, the yeast, it's not going to hurt. So my tare is 2.6. So I can goal it out at 2.7, which we're at. It's really not that much, just a little bit. So we can go outside now and do and pitch it. And we have a cover already out there, so we're all set with that. First thing I'm going to do is stir it up a little bit, see what we've got here. It's a little bit of a change. It's gotten more of a. You can take a look at it and you actually see it, because you were stirring it before. You'll see the. It's basically, it smells good, and it's basically thickened up a little bit and turned more into a, The conversion isn't going to be particularly great, I don't think, on this, but what I can do before I put the yeast in, we can do a. Let me put this. Let's take a measurement of the temperature to make sure we're not going too low. 125. I'm going to take a specific gravity reading just so we know we have it recorded, so we just get an idea of what we should normally have, or what we actually have. So we're down about 1.07. So that's okay. We're still hot. The yeast will cook in here. Okay, what I'm going to do is cool it down with this thing. This is just a chiller, and it's going to save a little time.
So you're saying that if you come back next week, you're going to...
Well, it's going to take 7 to 10 days probably.
See, this is basically step 1. Step 2 is the distillation process. I'd be curious to see that too.
Yeah, but without the permit, we can't really legally do that.
Oh, okay. So
I'm just explaining how to do it. Okay. I am going to send some water through here. Okay, so what we're doing now is that the wort is a little too hot, so I'm just putting a chiller in here. It's basically passing cold water through a coil of copper and chilling the mixture a little bit down so it falls below 100 degrees, so I can put the yeast in. And it'll survive in anything below 100, from 85 to 100, something like that. Take a little bit here to cool this down.